Evelyn Reed, CEO of Reed Global Architecture, believed the private broadcast to her executive team was a one-way feed, a tool for her to command the stage from the city's most important boardroom. She thought the cameras were off, or at least that their only purpose was to capture her impending triumph. She didn't know that the system's owner, the quiet man she called Art, the man she had just humiliated for a smudge on a glass panel, was recording everything. She didn't know that every condescending word, every dismissive gesture was being logged, archived, and timestamped. Within 24 hours, that recording wouldn't just cost her the biggest contract of her career. It would dismantle the entire glittering, fragile empire she had built on a foundation of lies. And we just love to see it, don't we? There's something so satisfying about the moment arrogance finally collides with consequence. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoy seeing the entitled Get What They Deserve, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of sweet, sweet justice. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to how it all began. The day started like any other for Arthur Vance, which is to say, it started in the quiet anonymity he had carefully cultivated for the past 18 months. To the employees of Reed Global, he was simply Art, the soft-spoken janitor from the night shift who sometimes covered daytime hours. He moved through the gleaming, minimalist halls of the architectural firm with a practiced invisibility, his cart a silent, rolling shadow against the polished concrete floors. His work was methodical, precise. He didn't just clean, he maintained. He saw the building not as a collection of surfaces to be wiped, but as a living entity, a complex system of glass, steel, and stone that breathed with the city around it. He understood its rhythms, its pressure points, the way the morning sun stressed the western-facing thermopanes, the way the HVAC system hummed with a slightly different tenor on humid days. He knew the building because, in a way, it was his. Or rather, it was supposed to be. The firm, now known as Reed Global, had once been Reed and Vance Architecture. It was a name that had been etched on the cornerstone of their first major project, a library that had redefined the city's public spaces. Thomas Vance, Arthur's father, had been the Vance in that equation. He was the visionary, the artist who dreamt of buildings that served communities, that harmonized with their environment. Marcus Reed Sr., Evelyn's father, had been the pragmatist, the businessman who turned those dreams into profitable realities. For decades, their partnership was the engine of the city's growth, a perfect balance of art and commerce. But after a stroke left Thomas Vance incapacitated, Marcus Sr. had seen his opportunity. Through a series of legally gray maneuvers and leveraging the trust of his ailing partner, he had systematically diluted Thomas's shares, restructured the company, and ultimately erased the Vance name from the letterhead, leaving his old friend with a pittance and a broken heart. Arthur had been a young man then, just finishing his master's degree in architecture at Cambridge, watching from afar as his father's legacy was stolen and repackaged as the singular triumph of the Reed family. His father, a man of immense pride and dignity, never spoke of the betrayal, but Arthur saw it in the hollowing of his eyes, in the way he stopped sketching, in the way the light of creation simply went out. Now, years later, Arthur pushed his cart past the firm's legacy wall, a monument to self-aggrandizement that featured a massive, flattering portrait of Marcus Reed Sr. and a timeline of achievements that conveniently began the year after Thomas Vance's departure. There was no mention of his father, no hint that half the designs celebrated on that wall had sprung from his mind. For anyone else, it would be a source of constant, burning rage. For Arthur, it was a reminder, a focus point. Justice, he had learned from his father's quiet suffering, was not a matter of passion. It was a matter of structure. It required a solid foundation, a meticulous plan, and the patience to see it built, brick by brick. His first brick was humility. His second was access. By taking the job as a janitor, he achieved both. No one looks at the man cleaning the floors. No one guards their words around the person emptying their trash. He became a ghost in the machine, observing, listening, learning the company's weaknesses, its rot, its hubris. And the epicenter of that hubris was Evelyn Reed. She arrived, as she always did, not by walking, but by making an entrance. A wave of expensive perfume preceded her, a herald of her approach. The low hum of office conversation would dip, then rise again, laced with a new tension. Evelyn was tall, severe, dressed in a tailored suit the color of a thundercloud. She didn't see the office as a collaborative space, but as a stage for her authority. Her eyes, the color of chipped slate, swept the lobby, not to appreciate its design, but to find fault. They landed on Arthur. He was polishing the large glass panel that separated the reception area from the main atrium, the very heart of the building his father had designed. "You," she said. The word was not a greeting, it was a summons, sharp and cold. Arthur stopped his work and turned, his expression placid. "Ms. Reed." She strode toward him, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the floor. She didn't stop at a conversational distance, but moved closer, forcing him to take a half-step back. It was a classic power move, designed to invade and intimidate. "What is this?" she asked, pointing a long, manicured finger at the glass. Arthur looked. He had just cleaned it. The surface was a flawless, invisible plane. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." "This." She jabbed her finger, leaving a perfect print in the center of the pane. "A smudge, right here, in the main lobby, where our clients, our $600 million clients who are arriving in 30 minutes, will see it. Do you have any idea what a smudge like this says about us?" Arthur looked from her furious face to the fingerprint she had just created. The irony was so thick he could taste it. He remained silent, letting her performance play out. This was a test, but not for him. It was a demonstration for the benefit of the half-dozen junior associates and assistants who had frozen at their desks, pretending not to watch. "It says we are careless," she continued, her voice rising. "It says we don't pay attention to detail. In our world, the world of architecture, detail is everything. A single misplaced line in a blueprint can compromise an entire structure. A smudge in the lobby suggests a rot that goes all the way to the core." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a contempt that was shockingly personal. "I would have thought that even someone of your capacity could grasp that. Apparently, I overestimate you. Clean it. And if I see so much as a single streak when our clients arrive, you and I will have a much more serious conversation about your future here, or lack thereof." She turned and swept away, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The receptionist stared at her keyboard, her cheeks flushed with vicarious embarrassment. Arthur slowly reached for a clean microfiber cloth. He looked at the fingerprint on the glass, the ghost of her touch. He felt no anger, no shame. He simply felt a quiet, cold clarity. He was an architect, after all. He understood that before you can build something new, you must first survey the site, understand the weaknesses of the existing structure, and plan the demolition. Evelyn Reed had just handed him the blueprints to hers. He carefully, methodically, erased the smudge until the glass was perfect once more. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. The office, having witnessed the CEO's casual display of cruelty, buzzed with a nervous energy. People were kinder to Arthur in the hallways, offering tight, sympathetic smiles. They saw a humble janitor being bullied by a powerful woman. They saw an injustice. What they didn't see was the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched Arthur's lips as he sorted recyclables in the utility closet. He wasn't a victim, he was a strategist, and his opponent was revealing her entire playbook. She was arrogant, she was impulsive, and she believed her own position was so unassailable that she could afford to be wantonly cruel to the people she deemed beneath her. It was a fatal flaw, as predictable and as catastrophic as a poorly calculated load-bearing wall. The clients, representatives from the Sterling Thorn Development Group, arrived for the pitch. It was the biggest project in the city's history, a multi-billion-dollar urban renewal initiative, the kind of legacy work that could immortalize a firm. Evelyn, transformed from office tyrant to charming visionary, greeted them with a dazzling smile. She led them on a tour, her voice a smooth, confident purr as she pointed out the firm's award-winning designs. They passed Arthur in a corridor where he was replacing a flickering light bulb. Evelyn ignored him completely, her gaze fixed on the senior developer, Mr. Sterling. But Sterling, an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for shrewdness, paused. "Everything all right up there, son?" he asked Arthur, his voice a low rumble. Arthur, balanced on the stepladder, nodded. "Just a faulty ballast, sir, an easy fix." Evelyn's smile tightened at the edges. The interruption, the momentary shift of focus away from her, was an annoyance. "Art is one of our best," she said, her tone dripping with false bonhomie, "always keeping things shining." She then turned to Sterling, placing a light hand on his arm to guide him away. "Now, if you'll follow me, the real show is this way." Arthur watched them go. He saw the way Evelyn's husband, Marcus, who was also a senior partner, lingered for a second. Marcus met Arthur's eyes with an expression that was a complicated mixture of apology and helplessness before scurrying to catch up with his wife. Marcus was the silent enabler, the man who knew his wife's behavior was wrong but lacked the spine to challenge it. He was a different kind of structural weakness, not a fatal flaw, but a point of ingress, a place where pressure, correctly applied, could crack the entire facade. Later that afternoon, the second humiliation occurred. Evelyn, high on the success of the initial client meeting, was holding an impromptu all-hands meeting in the main atrium. She stood on the wide, sweeping staircase, addressing her troops like a general before battle. She spoke of ambition, of vision, of their destiny to win the Sterling Thorn project. In the middle of her speech, her phone, which was connected to the atrium's sound system for dramatic effect, buzzed with an incoming call. Annoyed, she fumbled to silence it, and in the process knocked her expensive, stainless steel water bottle from the lectern. It tumbled down the marble stairs, clattering loudly before rolling to a stop near the back of the crowd, right at Arthur's feet. He had been quietly mopping up a coffee spill near the entrance, trying to remain unnoticed. Every head turned. The flow of Evelyn's speech was broken. A flush of irritation crossed her face. "Well, don't just stand there," she snapped, her voice amplified by the microphone, echoing through the cavernous space. "Art, pick it up." The command was so bald, so demeaning, that a collective intake of breath was audible. She wasn't asking, she was ordering the janitor to fetch for her in front of the entire company. Arthur looked down at the silver bottle, then up at her, his face unreadable. The room was silent. Time seemed to slow. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting the humiliation hang in the air, letting everyone feel its weight. He wanted them to remember this moment. He wanted them to be witnesses. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down. He didn't snatch the bottle, but picked it up with a careful, almost respectful motion. He inspected it for a moment, noting a small dent from the fall. Then he began to walk toward the staircase. The crowd parted for him, their eyes following his every move. He walked up the stairs, one by one, his work boots making no sound on the marble. He reached the landing where Evelyn stood, her arms crossed, a smug, impatient look on her face. He held out the water bottle. She reached for it, but he didn't let go immediately. For a fraction of a second, their hands were both on the cool metal. His gaze met hers. It was not a look of anger or subservience. It was a look of calm, quiet assessment. In that moment, he wasn't the janitor, he was her equal, and something in his steady gaze unnerved her. She felt a flicker of something she couldn't name, a primal sense of being seen, of being measured and found wanting. He released the bottle into her grasp. "There's a small dent, Ms. Reed," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "You should be more careful with your things." Then without another word, he turned and walked back down the stairs, retrieved his mop and bucket, and exited the atrium. The spell was broken. Evelyn, flustered for the first time, tried to resume her speech, but the energy was gone. The moment had been stolen from her. She held the dented water bottle in her hand, the cold metal a physical reminder of the subtle, inexplicable shift in power that had just occurred. She had intended to humiliate him, but somehow she felt like the one who had been put in her place. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to the stress of the pitch. He was nobody, a janitor. What could he possibly do? She had no idea that in his pocket, Arthur's hand was resting on a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was his father's last journal, filled with sketches, notes, and one final, brilliant, unfinished idea. An idea that was about to become a reality. That evening, Arthur did not go home to the rundown apartment his colleagues likely imagined for him. He took the subway to a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, entered a historic brownstone, and rode a private elevator to the penthouse. The apartment was a world away from the janitor's closet. It was a sprawling, open-plan space, furnished with a minimalist precision. Unfinished canvases leaned against one wall. Architectural models covered a vast work table, and an entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline. The centerpiece of the view was the library his father had designed, its warm, inviting light a beacon in the dusk. He shed the persona of art, along with the gray janitor's uniform. He showered, the day's humiliations washing away, leaving behind only a cold, clear resolve. Dressed in comfortable clothes, he walked over to the massive drafting table that dominated the living space. Under a sheet of protective vellum were the blueprints for a project of staggering ambition and elegance. It was his own proposal for the Sterling Thorne Urban Renewal Initiative. For months, he had been working in secret, fueled by coffee and a burning need for justice. He had used his invisible access to the Reed Global servers, not to steal proprietary data, that would be beneath him and his father's principles, but to study their approach. He reviewed their past projects, analyzed their methodologies, their cost overruns, their design philosophies. He saw what Evelyn was blind to. The firm had lost its soul. It had become a factory for glossy, soulless glass boxes, buildings that impressed on a spreadsheet but failed the human spirit. They were technically proficient but emotionally vacant. His own design was different. It was an evolution of his father's philosophy, updated for the 21st century. It was sustainable, community-focused, and deeply integrated with the city's history and geography. It was, he knew without a shred of doubt, a masterpiece. It was a tribute to his father and a repudiation of everything Reed Global had become. He picked up his father's journal, the symbolic object he carried with him always, its worn leather a comforting weight in his hand. He opened it to the last few pages. There, in his father's familiar, elegant script, was a series of questions and sketches, a nascent idea for a building that could breathe with the tides of the city. It was a concept for a public space that used kinetic architecture to adapt to weather and time of day, opening and closing like a flower. It was an idea decades ahead of its time, left unfinished by illness and betrayal. Arthur had taken that seed of an idea and nurtured it, using modern technology and materials to make it not only possible, but practical. It was the heart of his Sterling Thorne proposal. A chime from his laptop interrupted his thoughts. It was an alert from the financial tracking software he had set up. He walked over to the screen. For the past year, using the considerable inheritance his mother had left him, a fortune the Reeds knew nothing about, he had been engaged in a different kind of architectural project. Through a series of shell corporations and a discreet wealth management firm, he had been methodically buying up Reed Global's corporate debt. Evelyn, in her aggressive pursuit of growth, had leveraged the company to the hilt. She had taken out massive loans, confident that winning the Sterling Thorn project would allow her to pay them off and consolidate her power. She had no idea that her primary creditor, the anonymous entity that held the power to call in those loans and trigger a default, was the man who cleaned her toilets. The alert was simple. Another block of bonds had become available on the secondary market. He clicked purchase. Another piece of the foundation of her empire now belonged to him. He looked from the financial data on the screen to the architectural plans on his table. One was the weapon, the other was the vision. He was building a better future on the demolition of a corrupt past. The next day, Evelyn was riding high. The first meeting had gone well, and she was preparing for the final presentation. She felt invincible. She walked through the office, a queen surveying her domain, and her gaze, as if drawn by a magnet of disdain, found Arthur once again. He was in the executive kitchenette, carefully cleaning the impossibly complex espresso machine that was her pride and joy. This time, the humiliation was more subtle and therefore more insidious. She didn't raise her voice. She gathered a few of her senior vice presidents, including her husband Marcus, and walked into the kitchenette, pretending Arthur wasn't there. "The Sterling Thorn presentation is in 2 days," she began, leaning against the counter, deliberately crowding Arthur's space. "And I want to make one thing clear. We are not just selling a design. We are selling a brand. Our brand. A brand of excellence, of luxury, of untouchable success." She paused, picking up a sugar packet and examining it as if it were a fascinating artifact. "Every element must reflect that. The way we dress, the way we speak, the way we carry ourselves." Her eyes flicked to Arthur for a bare second, a micro-expression of contempt before returning to her VPs. "There is a hierarchy in life. There are those who create, who build, who lead, and there are those who service. It's important to remember that distinction. It's what keeps the world running smoothly." One of the sycophantic VPs chuckled. "God forbid we mix up the builders and the servicers." Evelyn smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "Exactly. Can you imagine?" She looked directly at her husband. "Marcus, darling, be a dear and get me a decaf latte, would you? This machine is far too complicated for me." It was a lie, of course. She operated it daily. The request was a performance, a way to underscore her point about who gives orders and who follows them. Marcus, looking deeply uncomfortable, began to fiddle with the machine. Arthur, his work finished, began to pack up his cleaning supplies. As he did, his elbow brushed a stack of presentation binders one of the VPs had placed precariously on the edge of the counter. The binders toppled, spilling a cascade of papers across the wet floor. A collective gasp. Evelyn's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. "You clumsy, incompetent fool," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Those are the presentation drafts for the Sterling Thorn project. Do you have any idea how much work you've just ruined?" The papers were soaked, the ink beginning to run. It was an accident, but in Evelyn's world, there were no accidents, only failures, and failure required a scapegoat. Before Arthur could even speak, she was on him. "Look at this. Just look at it. Is there anything you are capable of doing right? Anything at all?" The vice president stood frozen, unsure what to do. Marcus looked at the floor, his face a portrait of shame. Arthur knelt, his expression unreadable, and began to gather the ruined pages. He looked at the blurred architectural drawings, the smudged financial projections. He recognized them. They were almost identical to a proposal his father and Marcus Sr. had submitted for a much smaller project 25 years ago, just with bigger numbers and a shinier gloss. Evelyn wasn't a visionary. She was a plagiarist of her own father's work, which was itself built on his father's work. The rot, as she herself had said, went all the way to the core. He stood up, the soggy papers in his hand. He looked Evelyn directly in the eye. "These can be reprinted," he said, his voice calm and even. "It's the design itself that is the problem." The sheer audacity of the statement stunned the room into silence. The janitor was critiquing the CEO's work. Evelyn's face went from white with rage to a deep, mottled red. "What did you just say to me?" "I said," Arthur repeated slowly and clearly, "the design is the problem. It's uninspired. It's a copy of a copy. It lacks a soul. Mr. Sterling will see right through it." For a moment, Evelyn looked as if she might physically strike him. The air crackled with tension. Her VPs looked back and forth between the furious CEO and the impossibly calm janitor. It was Marcus who finally broke the spell. "Evelyn, that's enough," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's not worth it. Let's just go." Evelyn stared at Arthur for a long, venomous moment, her chest rising and falling. She seemed to be making a calculation. Firing him on the spot would be satisfying, but it would also give the incident more weight, more drama than it deserved. Dismissing him as beneath her notice was the better power play. "Get out of my sight," she finally spat, her voice trembling with contained rage. "Go. Now. I don't want to see your face again today." Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He dropped the ruined papers into the trash can, turned, and walked out of the kitchenette, the eyes of every person in the room burning into his back. He didn't go to the janitor's closet. He didn't clock out. He walked calmly out the front door of Reed Global, into the bright afternoon sun, and took out his phone. He made a single call. "It's time," he said into the phone. "Submit the proposal, the anonymous one, and arrange the presentation." The person on the other end, the discreet head of his wealth management firm, confirmed that it was all in place. The trap was set. The demolition was about to begin. The 48 hours that followed were the quiet before the storm. At Reed Global, a frantic energy took hold. The presentation drafts were reprinted, the teams rehearsed their lines, and Evelyn moved through the office like a caged panther, her fury from the kitchenette incident simmering just below the surface. She had fired Art the next morning via a curt memo to HR, a final, petty act of dismissal. She never wanted to see his face again, and now she wouldn't. The incident was forgotten, a minor annoyance on the path to her greatest victory. Her confidence, buoyed by her team of sycophants, was absolute. She was a Reed. They were born to win. Arthur, meanwhile, spent those 2 days in quiet preparation. He did not rehearse a speech. The truth did not require rehearsal. He spent time in his father's library, surrounded by the books on art, history, and philosophy that had shaped his own worldview. He reviewed the financial documents that proved his ownership of Reed Global's debt. He laid out a simple, elegant, dark blue suit, a stark contrast to the gray uniform he had worn for so long. And he spent a long time looking at his father's journal, not at the sketches, but at the handwriting, the physical trace of the man who had been his inspiration and his silent, suffering motivator. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a chaotic, destructive force. This was about restoration. It was about balance. It was about taking a structure that had become dangerously unsound and either shoring it up or tearing it down to build something better in its place. The day of the final presentation arrived. It was held not at the Reed Global offices, but in the neutral territory of the City Council's Grand Committee Room. The space was intimidating, all dark wood and high ceilings, designed to make petitioners feel small. But Evelyn Reed did not feel small. She felt perfectly at home. She stood at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, flanked by her husband and her top executives. Her presentation was flawless. The renderings were spectacular, the financial projections were aggressive, and her delivery was a masterclass in corporate charisma. She painted a picture of a future city shaped by her vision, a gleaming metropolis of steel and glass. As she concluded, a smug, satisfied smile played on her lips. She had nailed it. The committee members, led by the shrewd Mr. Sterling, were nodding, their expressions impressed. "Thank you, Ms. Reed," Sterling said, his voice neutral. "A very comprehensive presentation." Evelyn preened. "We believe it's not just a project, it's the future. And Reed Global is the future." Sterling shuffled some papers in front of him. "Indeed, we were very impressed. However, a second proposal was submitted for our consideration just before the deadline. It came in through an anonymous channel, which is a bit unorthodox, but the preliminary brief was so compelling we felt obligated to review it in full." A ripple of surprise went through Evelyn's team. Evelyn herself felt a flicker of annoyance. An anonymous competitor? Who had the audacity? "Of course," she said, her voice tight. "We welcome healthy competition." She was confident no one could touch their proposal. "This proposal," Sterling continued, looking down at the papers, "is different. It's less of a commercial development and more of a public trust. It integrates green space, historical preservation, and cutting-edge, sustainable technology in a way we've frankly never seen before. The vision is, and I don't use this word lightly, revolutionary." Evelyn's smile faltered. Her husband Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The presenter requested to remain anonymous until this meeting," Sterling said, looking toward the large double doors at the back of the room. "We've asked them to join us now to walk us through their vision, if you would." A bailiff opened the doors. For a moment, the figure standing in the doorway was just a silhouette against the bright light of the hallway. Then he stepped into the room. The collective gasp from the Reed Global team was audible. Marcus's face went white. Evelyn's jaw literally dropped. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a dawning, sickening horror. It was Arthur. He was not Art the janitor, he was Arthur Vance. He wore the impeccably tailored dark blue suit. His stride was confident, his posture perfect. He carried a slim leather portfolio in one hand. He looked like he owned the room. In a few minutes he would. He walked to the head of the table, to the spot opposite Evelyn. He didn't look at her. He addressed his attention entirely to Mr. Sterling and the committee. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Arthur Vance." The name landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Vance, the name that had been erased, the name that was a ghost in the machine of Reed Global. Evelyn stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in the janitor's uniform with the poised, powerful figure standing before her. It wasn't possible. It was a nightmare. "Vance?" Sterling said, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Any relation to Thomas Vance?" Arthur allowed himself a small, sad smile. "He was my father." A murmur went through the committee. Thomas Vance was a legend, a revered figure from a bygone era of architectural integrity. Suddenly, the anonymous proposal didn't seem unorthodox. It seemed like the return of a dynasty. "I am here to present the Agora Project," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady. He opened his portfolio. "But before I do, I feel I owe the committee and Ms. Reed an explanation for my unconventional approach." He finally turned his gaze on Evelyn. The contempt was gone from her face, replaced by a confusion so profound it was almost childlike. Her world was tilting on its axis, and she was struggling to find her footing. "For the past 18 months, Arthur began, his voice resonating with quiet authority in the acoustically perfect room, "I have been an employee of Reed Global. I worked as a janitor." The committee members stared at him, then at Evelyn, their expressions shifting from curiosity to intense scrutiny. This was no longer just a project presentation. It was a drama, and they had front-row seats. "I took the job because I wanted to understand the company that had once borne my family's name. I wanted to see what had become of my father's legacy. And what I saw, he said, his gaze sweeping over Evelyn and her team, was a company with a rotten core. A company that prioritized profit over people, image over integrity. A company led by individuals who believe that kindness is a weakness and that respect is something you can demand rather than something you must earn. His eyes locked on Evelyn's. He began the list of grievances not with anger, but with the cold, precise delivery of a prosecutor reading an indictment. I saw a CEO who would publicly humiliate an employee for a smudge she herself had made on a piece of glass. I saw a leader who, in front of her entire staff, would order a man to fetch her water bottle like a dog. I saw a team of executives who would stand by and watch as their boss verbally abused a man for an accident. And then, I heard the leader of that company, a person responsible for shaping the very skyline of our city, critique a janitor's worth as a human being. With each sentence, a little more color drained from Evelyn's face. She was no longer a powerful CEO. She was a defendant in the court of her own arrogance. You see, Arthur continued, turning back to the committee, Ms. Reed believes in hierarchies. She believes there are creators and there are servicers. What she fails to understand is that we all service something. A janitor services a building. A good architect services a community. A great architect services the human spirit. The only thing Ms. Reed's architecture services is her own ego. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he gestured to the projector. Now, if I may, I would like to show you what an architecture of service looks like. For the next 20 minutes, Arthur didn't just present a project. He unveiled a philosophy. The Agora project was breathtaking. It was a multi-block, mixed-use development that wove public parks, affordable housing, and commercial spaces into a seamless, beautiful whole. At its heart was the kinetic structure from his father's journal, a grand public pavilion whose roof, made of translucent energy-gathering panels, would open and close with the sun, creating a dynamic play of light and shadow. The design was innovative, beautiful, and deeply, profoundly human. He spoke not of profit margins, but of community gathering spaces. He spoke not of luxury brands, but of daycare centers and public art installations. He showed how the project would not only be carbon neutral, but carbon negative, actively cleaning the air in its district. When he finished, the room was silent. The committee members were spellbound. Mr. Sterling looked as if he had just seen the future. Evelyn and her team were forgotten, their glossy, soulless proposal already a distant memory. But Arthur wasn't finished. This was the moment for the quiet bomb. There is one final matter, he said, turning from the projection screen. He looked directly at Evelyn. The live feed from the boardroom was still active, broadcasting this entire confrontation to the executive suites at Reed Global. She had wanted a show. He was giving them one. Ms. Reed's presentation was predicated on the idea that Reed Global has the financial strength and stability to undertake a project of this magnitude. This is, unfortunately, not the case. Evelyn finally found her voice. That is an outrageous lie. Our financials are solid. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Are they? You've leveraged the company to fund your aggressive expansion, taking on hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Debt that was bundled and sold on the secondary market. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table to Mr. Sterling. That debt is currently held by a single entity, a private holding company called the Vance Foundation. He let that sink in. A foundation I control, which means, Ms. Reed, that for the last year, you have been, for all intents and purposes, working for me. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. She looked at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. Marcus put his head in his hands. The other executives stared in blank horror. They weren't just losing a contract, they were losing the entire company. The loans have covenants, Arthur continued, his voice devoid of emotion. Covenants that require the company to maintain a certain level of reputational integrity. Covenants that can be called due in the event of gross mismanagement or conduct that could damage the firm's standing. I think we can all agree after today that those conditions have been met. He looked at Evelyn, the man she had called a clumsy, incompetent fool. You were worried about a smudge on the glass, Evelyn. You should have been worried about the rot in the foundation. The silence in the room was absolute. Evelyn Reed, the titan of industry, the untouchable queen of architecture, was broken. She sat amidst the ruins of her life's work, a monument to her own hubris. The camera she had thought was her ally had become her executioner, broadcasting her utter and complete annihilation to the very people she had ruled through fear. The man she had tried to erase had erased her instead. He had not raised his voice. He had not used a single insult. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered her. Mr. Sterling finally cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He looked at the sheet of paper, then at Arthur, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "it seems we have a great deal to discuss." The immediate aftermath was chaos condensed into a single, silent moment of realization for Evelyn's team. As Mr. Sterling and the committee members rose to shake Arthur's hand, officially awarding the Sterling Thorne Project to the Vance Foundation, Evelyn remained seated, a statue carved from ice. The life, the fight, the fire in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. She was looking at the end of her world. Marcus finally moved. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly in the quiet room. He looked at his wife, then at Arthur, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: shame, regret, and a sliver of something that looked almost like relief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He had stood by, a silent partner in her cruelty, and now he was a silent witness to her demise. Arthur's gaze was not triumphant. It was weary. He had won, but the victory felt heavy. He had demolished the corrupt structure, but the debris was the lives and careers of people who, for all their faults, were still just people. He looked at Marcus, the silent enabler. "You have a choice to make, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. "You can go down with this sinking ship, or you can start learning how to swim." Without another glance at Evelyn, Arthur turned and followed Mr. Sterling out of the room, leaving the Reed Global team to drown in the silence. The live feed to the executive suites had been cut the moment Arthur revealed his control of the debt, but it was too late. The news spread through the company like a virus. First whispers, then frantic emails, then outright panic. The Queen had been deposed. The kingdom was in revolt. In the days that followed, the full extent of Arthur's plan became clear. It was not a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. It was a structural reformation. He called an emergency board meeting. As the majority death holder, he had the legal right to restructure the company to ensure its solvency. The old board, composed of Evelyn's loyalists, was summarily dismissed. A new provisional board was appointed, with David Chen, the older, respected architect who remembered and revered Thomas Vance, as its interim chairman. David had been one of the first people to call Arthur after the news broke. "I always knew there was more to you, son," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be so proud." David became Arthur's unexpected ally, his voice of experience and institutional memory, helping to separate the salvageable parts of the company from the rot. Arthur's approach was methodical and, to the surprise of many, merciful. He did not engage in a mass purge. He understood that many employees had simply been trying to survive under a toxic leadership. He and David Chen held a series of town hall meetings, not to issue decrees, but to listen. They asked the architects, the draftsmen, the administrative staff what they needed, what their frustrations were, what their dreams were for the company. For the first time in years, the people who actually did the work felt heard. There were, however, consequences. The sycophantic vice presidents who had laughed at Evelyn's cruel jokes were given generous severance packages and shown the door. Their brand of loyalty was not something Arthur valued. For Evelyn, the consequences were more profound. She was stripped of her title, her office, her authority. Her shares in the company, leveraged against the very loans Arthur now controlled, were worthless. In a single afternoon, she had gone from CEO to nothing. She and Marcus holed up in their cavernous, minimalist mansion, a house that now felt like a tomb. The silence between them was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Marcus, finally freed from the shadow of his wife's ambition, found his voice. He confessed his shame, his cowardice, his regret for not standing up for what was right, for not defending the man he knew was being wronged. "I saw what you were doing, Evelyn," he said, his voice raw. "I saw how you treated him, how you treated everyone, and I did nothing. I was weak, and I am as much to blame for this as you are." Evelyn, for her part, cycled through the stages of grief with a terrifying velocity: denial, rage, bargaining. She called lawyers who politely informed her that Arthur's actions were legally airtight. She tried to rally support from her old contacts, who suddenly stopped returning her calls. The world she had dominated now shunned her. Her power had been a mirage, dependent on a title and a company that were no longer hers. Without them, she was just a woman in a big, empty house. A week after the presentation, Arthur requested a meeting, not with Evelyn, but with Marcus. They met in a small, neutral cafe, far from the gleaming towers of the financial district. Arthur looked tired but centered. Marcus looked like a ghost. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. "After everything she did, this isn't just business, it's personal." Arthur took a sip of his coffee. "It was always personal. She made it personal when her father stole my father's legacy. She made it personal when she erased his name from the company he built. She made it personal every time she used her power to diminish someone else to make herself feel bigger." He looked at Marcus with a piercing clarity. "She made it personal, but I am choosing to make the resolution professional." He slid a folder across the table. "This is a proposal. I am renaming the company. It will be Vance and Chen Architecture, but I am keeping the Reed Global portfolio and its staff. David and I can't run it alone. We need good people." He paused. "You are a good architect, Marcus. You were, before you let her ambitions swallow yours. There is a senior partnership position available. It's yours if you want it. No strings attached to your personal life. Your talent is yours, and the company needs it." Marcus was stunned into silence. He had expected condemnation, not a lifeline. "But Evelyn—" "Evelyn is a separate matter," Arthur said. He slid a second, much thinner folder across the table. "This is for her." Later that day, Marcus returned home and handed the thin folder to his wife. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a demand for payment. It was a job offer. An entry-level position. An assistant draftsperson. The salary was a fraction of what her driver used to make. The office was not a corner suite, but a cubicle in the basement, where the archives were stored. It was the most exquisitely tailored, most devastatingly poetic act of justice she could have imagined. He wasn't destroying her. He wasn't casting her out into the street. He was offering her a path. A long, humbling, arduous path back to relevance, starting from the very bottom. He was giving her the chance to choose, to cling to the memory of her unearned power, or to embrace the dignity of work, to learn the humility she had so despised, to become a builder instead of a destroyer. It was a cruel kindness, a merciless act of grace. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Reed was faced with a choice that had nothing to do with profit or status or power. It was a choice about her own character. The silence in the great empty house was no longer accusing. It was waiting, waiting for her answer. The weeks turned into months. The transformation of Reed Global into Vance and Chen Architecture was more than just a name change on the door. It was a cultural revolution. The long hours and high-pressure tactics of Evelyn's reign were replaced by a focus on work-life balance and creative collaboration. The firm started a mentorship program for young architects from disadvantaged backgrounds. They took on pro bono projects for local nonprofits. The office, once a place of tension and fear, became a place of excitement and innovation. The architects, freed from the constraints of producing soulless glass boxes, began to dream again. Their work became more daring, more meaningful. Arthur Vance, the man who had been the catalyst for this change, settled into his new role with the same quiet competence he had displayed as a janitor. He wasn't a charismatic, spotlight-seeking CEO like Evelyn. He was a leader who led by example. He spent more time at the drafting tables with the junior designers than in the boardroom. He knew every employee by name, not because he had studied a roster, but because he genuinely cared about the people he worked with. He had restored his father's name to the firm, but more importantly, he had restored his father's ethos, that architecture was, at its core, a public service. The Agora project broke ground to citywide celebration. Arthur, standing on the stage next to Mr. Sterling and the mayor, looked out at the crowd. He wasn't wearing the dark blue power suit from the presentation, but a simple, comfortable jacket. He looked like just another person, but his vision was about to reshape the city for generations to come. He spoke briefly, not of himself, but of his father, of the power of community, and of the responsibility that comes with the ability to build. And what of the Reeds? Marcus accepted Arthur's offer. The first few months were difficult. He had to earn the trust of colleagues who had once seen him as part of the problem. But stripped of his wife's toxic influence, the talented, principled architect he had once been began to reemerge. He worked hard, stayed late, and offered his expertise without ego. He and Arthur developed a cautious but respectful working relationship, two men bound by a complicated history trying to build a better future. They never spoke of Evelyn. Evelyn did not accept the job offer. Her pride would not allow it. For a while, she disappeared from the public eye. The society pages that had once chronicled her every move now ignored her existence. Rumors circulated. Some said she had had a complete breakdown. Others said she and Marcus had divorced and she had moved to Europe, living off the remains of a family trust. But one day, about a year after the fateful presentation, Arthur saw her. He was walking through the construction site of the Agora, inspecting the foundation work. He saw a woman in a hard hat and a safety vest, holding a clipboard and talking to a foreman. Her hair was cut short, her face was devoid of makeup, and she wore sturdy work boots. She looked older, leaner, but her posture was straight, her gaze intense. It was Evelyn. He learned from the site manager that she had taken a low-level project management course at the community college. She had started her own small consulting firm, just her, a laptop, and a cell phone. She took on the small, unglamorous jobs no one else wanted, coordinating permits for residential renovations, overseeing minor compliance inspections. She was, against all odds, starting over, from the ground up. She saw him watching her. For a long moment their eyes met across the bustling construction site. There was no animosity in her gaze, no lingering resentment. There was only a quiet, weary acceptance. She gave him a short, single nod, not of deference, but of acknowledgement, a nod between two builders. Then she turned and went back to her work. Arthur nodded back, a slow smile touching his lips. He had not offered her redemption. Redemption cannot be given, it can only be earned. But he had given her a choice. And in her own way, she had taken it. The demolition was complete. The ground was cleared. Something new was being built. As he stood there, the sounds of construction echoing around him, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. Justice wasn't about victory or defeat. It wasn't about punishing the wicked or rewarding the virtuous. It was about balance. It was about clearing away the rotten structures to make way for something that could grow, something strong and true. His father's journal was in his office, resting on the corner of his desk, but he no longer needed to carry it. The lessons were a part of him now. He looked up at the steel skeleton of the Agora Pavilion, rising against the blue sky, a testament to a vision of a better world. A world where worth is measured not by status, but by integrity. A world where even the most arrogant can learn humility, and where the quiet, underestimated man can, with patience and a solid plan, change everything. The cameras were finally, truly, off, and the real work had just begun. In the end, the story of Arthur Vance and Evelyn Reed wasn't a simple tale of revenge. It was a lesson in the architecture of character. Evelyn had built her life like one of her buildings, a glittering, fragile facade with a hollow core. She believed power was a weapon to be wielded. Arthur understood that true power is a tool to be used for building. He showed her and the world that you can't build a lasting legacy on a foundation of arrogance and disrespect. What do you think? Did Evelyn deserve the second chance she eventually made for herself? Or was Arthur too merciful? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Remember that true strength isn't about how loudly you can shout, but how patiently you can build. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that in the end, character is the only thing that truly endures.